The Larry Kudlow Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
So, one of the key points to the stock market and the economy, which most economists don't understand, so-called demand-siders, is the importance of profits. Profits. Profits are the mother's milk of stocks. Profits tell you whether the company's making money or not. And if they're making money, they can hire, they can produce goods and services, and pay wages and help families with their income at the kitchen table. But profits are very, very strong. And that's an important part of the stock market rally, in addition to all the goings-on in the Strait of Hormuz and oil prices and the war. We're still going in the right direction. I mean, the blockade is going to eventually take its toll on Iran. But anyway, let's bring in John Carney, Breitbart news editor for economics and finance and co-author of the Breitbart Business Digest. I happen to know that he snuck a few days off, but I know that he's ready to rock and roll. You know, there's a couple of things I want to talk to you about, John, but one of them is early numbers coming out in the first quarter for profits are really huge, up 30-40%. And that's one of the drivers. But, you know, the model itself is so interesting to me. So economists always start with consumer spending and demand and stuff. They don't look at profits as an economic factor, you know, as an economic growth factor, or as a stock market factor. But they should, because you can't have a healthy business that's not making money.
That's right. You're also not going to hire people, which means people won't have money to spend because they don't have jobs. You're not giving people raises. All of that comes from profits. You're absolutely right. We had a very good the last quarter of 2025, even though the total economic growth, GDP numbers weren't very high. A lot of that had to do with the government shutdown. The profits were good. The numbers now are looking very good for this year. Just the kind of standard Wall Street projection actually is very good. And I think that's actually understating how good things are going to be. I think Morgan Stanley has S&P 500 profits rising 17% in 2026. That's a good number. And I think what we're seeing is actually in a lot of the early returns from just this first quarter, the end of the first quarter, beginning of the second quarter, where we have this Iran war and the Gulf of Hormuz shutdown, it actually doesn't seem to have weighed on the economy very much at all yet, as far as we can tell.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And it's wrapping up quickly, which is, the Strait of Hormuz is open, as President Trump said it would be, which means that the impact will be very low once that starts flowing through.
Well, we don't know that quite yet because the events this morning, the Iranians start shooting down tankers again. So I don't know whether the Strait of Hormuz is opening up or not, but the bigger point is just how resilient the economy is and how profitable it is and how much productivity it has. Let me ask you another thing. It's in your absence this week, I was interviewing John Yoo, YOO, the lawyer, constitutional lawyer, who I guess worked for George W. Bush. He's out teaching at Berkeley, UCal Berkeley Law School, Bolt Law School. And we're talking about your favorite subject, John, and that is Jay Powell and the Fed and Kevin Warsh, and
right,
whether Jay will ever be Fed chairman for life. Here's the gist of it. This is you. This is him talking, and he said it on the air. If the Justice Department asks an agency for documents, the agency has to give it to them. Now, in this particular case, there's no criminal charge. They just asked for documents. And the Federal Reserve lawyers continue to refuse to provide the documents. You can't do that. It's part of the executive branch. You've got to pony up what they're asking for. Either that or, find a very good reason not to. And you said that if they continue to withhold these documents, which presumably have to do with the cost overruns, I don't know why that's such a big deal. I don't know what the Fed is hiding. Who knows? But you could fire the head of the agency for cause. In other words, it's not the cost overruns. It's not necessarily a criminal charge. It's the fact that you don't comply with the Justice Department's request for documents that could conceivably allow the president to fire the Fed chairman for cause. The cause here would be disobeying an executive branch order. What do you make of that?
I think that's absolutely right. It's very strange. The Fed seems to be invoking something that has never been invoked before, which is its own version of executive privilege.
Yes.
And that's wrong. They don't have that. The different branches of government have that against each other. So Congress can say some things are privileged against the executive branch or against the judiciary. Judiciary has lots of things that are secret. The executive branch, when Congress asks questions, can say, no, that's part of it. But when you have the executive branch asking the Fed isn't its own constitutional branch of government. It cannot say, no, you don't get to look at our documents. And in fact, the fact that in itself, I think the overreach, the implicit invocation of a non-existent privilege is a good reason to investigate. Why are they? People aren't asking the right question.
Right.
Because why wouldn't the Fed comply? Why, if they have nothing to hide, and I'm not sure they do, as you said, it's just about cost overruns on a building. Why wouldn't they comply? It doesn't really make sense. It seems maybe it's just Powell's stubbornness. He didn't. But look, there are grown-up lawyers at the Fed. It's not all just Jay Powell. They should have been telling him, hey, look, we should turn this stuff over. They want to look at it. We didn't do anything wrong. Turn it over to them. What are they going to do with it?
John Yoo was saying, next thing you know, the SEC won't comply, the FTC, the Treasury Department. In other words, you'd have complete chaos in the executive branch. You can't do this. And,
that's right.
And no one's charged the Fed with anything. But what are they hiding in these documents? It's the strangest story. That's the principle of it. You follow? It's not about Jay Powell. It's not even about Kevin Warsh. Everybody wants Warsh to get in. It's about the withholding of these documents. And you cannot do that.
How do you hold any branch of government accountable if they say, no, we're not going to, they're going to tell another part of the government we're not going to show it. So you could have, whether it's the national, the Labor Relations Board, the government is full of these boards. The fact that they're trying to say, no, we won't turn over the document, I think John Yoo is right. That is actually a good reason to be able to remove somebody, because frankly, it is as if they are trying to declare themselves. Look, they're independent in a sense, but that just means they get to decide monetary policy without consulting everybody else. It doesn't mean that they get to run themselves completely unaccountably to either the executive or Congress. I think Congress, actually, the Republicans, look, Tom Tillis doesn't like that Jeanine Pirro had said subpoenas. He should actually hold a hearing and demand all of those documents himself.
Right. That's the right way to do it. Senator McCormick, Dave McCormick, said that on the show. Exactly right. Move the investigation to the Senate Banking Committee and explore that right then and there. And that could be an off-ramp for Tillis. That would give him a good sense of, what the story is. And
investigate why they didn't turn it over. Like you said, I think this is really important. We want to know the original part, but I also want to know, what were they thinking when they said, no, we're not going to answer these, requests for documents. What was the point there? What was the theory of law that allowed them to stiff arm the Justice Department?
Yep, that's the thing. That's the key thing. Because if they do it, John, everybody will do it. Everybody will do it. Then you'll have chaos in the executive branch, and you can't have that. Doesn't work that way. Anyway, that's the key point in your absence. So we'll follow up on that when you come back. John Carney, Breitbart News. John's co-author of the daily Breitbart Business Digest, and we will be talking this coming week. Thanks so much, folks. We'll take a break. And then I'm going to talk to former Energy Secretary Dan Brouillette, because the United States is emerging now as the leading energy producer, the most reliable energy producer. We have a new world order in energy as a result of this Iranian war. I'm Kudlow. We'll be right back.
Thanks for listening to The Larry Kudlow Show. You can hear The Larry Kudlow Show Saturday mornings at 10. If you like the podcast, share it with your friends and listen anytime at WABCRadio.com and download the WABC Radio app. Hit that subscribe button on all major podcast platforms. Plus, follow WABC on social on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X. See you next time for a new episode so you never have to wonder.
What the heck is going on here?